Welcome back to the Commissioner's Office, Episode 3. Pardon my somewhat raspy voice today. Just got back from nearly a week at the beach. Too much alcohol. Hard life, I know. We'll be talking about Cover 2 today. And we have as our guest later on this episode, RaiderRed of the Dallas Cowboys. He's been in the league since the beginning of Madden 15. Anyone who's been in our league since then or over that period of time knows he wins 10 to 12 games a year, sometimes even more. And he's been running Cover 2 since the beginning. So we'll start with an overview of Cover 2 zone itself, and then we'll talk about Tampa 2. So Cover 2, obviously, you have at a very basic level two safeties dropping back into deep half coverages, each covering one half of the field in those deep blue zones. You have two cornerbacks on the outside, each defending the flat zone there on the outside. And then you have three linebackers in short underneath zone. I do want to say that the entire context of the episode that I'll be talking about is assuming that you're in a 4-3 front. I'm not saying you couldn't run a vanilla normal Cover 2 scheme out of a 3-4, but we're really going to spend a lot more time on Tampa 2, as that tends to be the more sophisticated version, and that's what's probably going to work better in Madden and in real life, frankly. And that's just absurdly difficult, I think, to run out of a 3-4. I'm sure that there have been 3-4 fronts in the NFL over the last 20 years that have used some of the principles of a Tampa 2 or a Cover 2, but I'm just not really familiar with any team that has done that, and certainly not any team that has run a true Tampa 2 to any level of success. All the Tampa 2s that you know about, the Buccaneers, the Bears, the Colts, all ran out of a 4-3. So strengths of a Cover 2. Again, we're still on the basic Cover 2 principles first, and we'll talk about what Tampa 2 does differently. Strengths are it shuts down run after the catch on those short passes. It is definitely a bend but don't break defense. The idea is that you're going to give up those underneath routes, but you have somebody ready to make the tackle and hit them really hard the moment they're catching the ball. Its origins date back all the way really to the 70s era Steelers. Tony Dungy credits those Steeler teams for kind of teaching him the principle, and that's one of the first teams that started to put a middle linebacker in coverage over the middle to combat Bill Walsh's West Coast offense, which relied a lot on those short passes where the ball doesn't travel very far in the air and setting receivers up for large gains in terms of run after the catch. Tampa 2 or Cover 2 does a pretty good job of clogging those passing lanes on those short to medium passes. It's a very safe coverage, keeps receivers in front of the defenders, like I alluded to. So it does. The idea is that you will prevent those huge gains from happening. And as you get closer to the goal line, it actually becomes arguably more effective, hence the bend but don't break. There's two major weak spots inherent in a Cover 2 that a good passing game can exploit. Number one, as almost every Madden player knows, the seams up the middle of the field, which are often run by tight ends, but certainly could also be a slot wide receiver, destroy a Cover 2. Additionally, those outside sideline routes, in both cases, seams and sidelines, you're really talking verticals. It doesn't have to be verticals, but that's the number one route that just kills that. And so what happened was Tony Dungy took those principles from those Steelers team, and he got a head coaching job in Tampa Bay, and the Tampa 2 was born. It's designed to fix the primary weakness of a standard Cover 2, which is, again, those seams over the middle between the two safeties. The middle linebacker drops into a deep zone on passing plays to where it basically becomes a Cover 3. Anytime there's a tight end or a slot wide receiver running up those seams, it turns into a Cover 3 after the snap. The Tampa 2 puts a premium, just philosophically, it's important to know, on undersized, very, very fast players who hit very hard and are sure tacklers. So you're sacrificing size and strength, and you're gaining speed, and you need smart players too, because they have to cover a lot of ground, which means their positioning and taking the right angle on the ball is very important. Overall, Tampa 2 is probably a low-risk defense because it does prevent those huge plays, and I would call it kind of a low-risk, medium reward. So it is a pretty good and very viable base defense. We'll talk a little bit more in a minute on how, because there is a preconception among the Madden community, I believe, that Cover 2 is bad in Madden, and there's definitely a lot of truth to that, but we'll talk about kind of how to fix that. And hopefully, in heading into Madden 17, they've talked at length about Cover 2 and adjusting it to be more of a true Tampa 2. And so hopefully some of these things will happen more organically. In terms of weaknesses, the Tampa 2 is more vulnerable to the run than a normal cover 2 because you have those smaller, faster guys. If you have an offense that lines up with a big, strong, run-blocking offensive line, Tampa 2 is pretty vulnerable to power run schemes. It's not necessarily that bad against sweeps and stretches and stuff like that on the outside because you do have guys that can get out on the outside. But in terms of a power game running up the gut, you're going to be in trouble. Another reason for that is that middle linebacker I talked about that drops into coverage. His first read has to be whether or not it's a run, but he has to be prepared to drop deep. So he kind of has a little bit more. You need that middle linebacker to be really special because he can't just key only on the run. He has to be worried about the tight end or wide receiver going deep over the middle. It's also specifically vulnerable to 4 verticals, which obviously is a play that Madden players love to run. The Tampa 2 can still defend it. It's always going to be a weakness, but it still can be defended. We'll talk a little bit more about how to shade corners to make that a little bit easier to defend, but it will always be somewhat of a weakness. That's just the way it is. For play calling, I mentioned it's a very viable base defense, but it's extraordinarily personnel dependent. It's probably the most personnel dependent coverage, in my opinion, certainly in Madden, of anything that we'll be covering in this series. Even more so than man, in my opinion, because it's a little bit harder, I think, to mask some of the weaknesses of cover 2 by being a really strong user. Whereas in man, if you have 1 or 2 cornerbacks that is a weak spot, you can kind of play that linebacker or safety over the middle and double cover, I guess, kind of take that away. It's a lot harder to do that in cover 2. I mentioned leverage for your cornerbacks. In a cover 2, you always want to be shading your cornerbacks outside. You need that outside leverage. The reason is you are trying to prevent wide receivers from releasing to the outside, especially on vertical routes, but even on outs or corners, anything like that. When they release to the outside, then get to the sidelines easier and quicker, which means those safeties, since there's only 2 of them, they have to guard everything from the seam all the way to the sideline. And if the wide receiver is just getting that sideline unhurried, unbumped, then the safety is not going to have time to get over and prevent that. In terms of usering, I do not run a base cover 2, so I'm going to speak a little bit hypothetically here on how I would do it, and maybe we'll even be doing it in Madden 17, but we'll also speak a little bit later on with somebody who does it. But the reason I think cover 2 is really interesting is because when people play Madden, when they user, they tend to pick a middle linebacker. That's certainly not the only way to do it, but that's kind of the obvious choice for a lot of Madden players. They like to patrol the middle. Another reason is because they like to take away the tight end over the seam. This is probably starting to sound familiar. Madden players effectively identified the same weakness that the NFL identified back when vanilla cover 2 was being run, and they answered it in the same exact way. They did it by usering. So usering the middle linebacker in a Tampa 2 is great, and that's probably the most obvious choice. You can carry those tight ends deep. Corners aren't as much of a problem in Tampa 2 as long as you have cornerbacks that can drop a little bit deeper in their zones. But you can patrol the middle, and on deeper plays over the middle, you can carry your linebacker deep, which a lot of people do anyway. You probably want to avoid using your free safety or strong safety since they're your deep half guys or they're on the sidelines when the middle linebacker does drop into that deep third zone over the middle. But they're not ball hawkers. They're not playmakers. They're deep. They're deepest of the deepest. They're your safety blanket. If you really want to use the safety, I probably wouldn't use run cover 2. I'd probably stick to a cover 1 or a cover 3 where you can kind of play your strong safety or free safety all over the field. Tampa 2 might actually, and this is interesting to me, I don't know of any user that does that off the top of my head, but I would definitely mix this in if I ran it. Might be one of the rare defenses where using a cornerback would lead to a pretty big impact. And man, you tend not to do that. Even if you could do it well, you're just shutting down one receiver. But in a Tampa 2, the cornerback has the responsibility for that flats. So if you're a really strong user and they have 2 or 3 wide receivers on one side of the field, I could absolutely see situations where a cornerback could be really effective, especially on like 3rd and 8 or 3rd and 6 or 3rd and long, where you have a very definitive first down marker. So I'd be interested to hear from someone if they use the corners in Tampa 2, because I think it'd be very effective. You also have the luxury of aggressively jumping the wide receivers' routes. to try to get the interception without giving up a big play if you miss. Typically, if you're using a corner and you jump a route and you miss, that's like a touchdown or a 30-yard gain. But the whole point of cover 2 of Tampa 2 is your corners can do that. In fact, they're supposed to be doing that. So probably the most important thing of Tampa 2, because it's a fairly simple defense. So you don't blitz much. There's really not much in the way of confusion. You kind of know where everyone's going to be covering, but it's personnel. That's what's going to make you more successful. So I want to start off with what you don't need, which is elite coverage cornerbacks. It sounds very counterintuitive because cornerbacks are actually still very important to the Tampa 2. But what I mean when I say you don't need elite coverage cornerbacks, you don't need the same type of corners that someone running a man or a cover 3 shell would need. You don't need those guys to be lockdown corners with ridiculously high speed and agility, or people that can man up. A Tampa 2 corner needs to be able to, first and foremost, to jam wide receivers at the line. Press is incredibly important for a Tampa 2 corner. Ratings just came out, so they changed a little bit. I would say in Madden 16, like bare minimum, I'd want 85 plus press. And really, since it wasn't that expensive to upgrade, I'd be looking for 90 plus out of a Tampa corner because you don't really need to maximize their other ratings that much. So again, press, super important. I would argue it's even more important than zone coverage. That's debatable, but either way, it's way up there. You don't need man coverage, obviously, but you also don't need speed. I would be totally comfortable, and I mean this, with an 86 speed cornerback in Tampa 2, because they're really not going to have to ever go deep. The deepest they'll ever have to do is dropping, 12, if you really wanted them deep, maybe 15 yards down that sideline to prevent that corner route. But for the most part, what they're doing is they're dropping, 12 yards downfield. They're preventing those outside routes just long enough for the safety to get over there. And then if a running back or a tight end starts running the flat, then you'll see the corner will come up, and they don't prevent the catch, but they limit it to, a 3 to 5 yard gain instead of, an 8 or 10 yard gain. So I would be comfortable with 86 speed. You don't really need a lot of agility. Acceleration, I think, matters a lot because you do need the ability to close in on those flat routes. And also in a Tampa 2 corner, you need them to be a little bit stronger, much better tackler than you would normally care about with corners. I mean, obviously, you're not going to be finding corners that are 80 in tackling, but if you have that corner that's just cannot tackle, I would not put them out there in a cover 2. Zone coverage is obviously important. That's self-explanatory. It is a zone coverage scheme. But there are a couple of different spots where Tampa 2, it's important that you invest your premium resources. If you listen to my last episode, kind of cover what I mean by that. The first and foremost is middle linebacker. They need to be a freakish athlete. They need to be really fast, elite speed for a middle linebacker, acceleration, elite acceleration. They don't probably need tons of agility, but they need to be excellent in zone coverage. I'd say in the last Madden, I'm looking at no lower than 75, and really you want 80 plus zone coverage. I would even say that, try to get it to 80 plus in the new one, is in the new kind of rating system as well. But that's the thing, is they can't just be a tiny, weak drop back linebacker. They also need to be a strong and sure tackler, because their responsibilities are huge. They need to first read whether it's a run, and if so, they're helping against the run. And we've already said that Tampa 2 values undersized, fast guys. Well, that goes for the defensive line as well, which means that middle linebacker is needed. You don't have just 4 hogs up front to just completely shut down the run by themselves. They need this middle linebacker to help. But on the other hand, if it's a tight end or even a wide receiver going up the middle on a seam route, they need to be able to drop, 20, 30 yards downfield. So I would say play recognition is absurdly important on top of physicals. They can't just be a physical freak unless, of course, you're going to user them every single play. But he needs to have that amazing play recognition so he can instantly diagnose whether it's a pass versus a run and cover that incredible range that we talked about. Brian Urlacher was the prototype, I would say, in a modern example. And he doesn't play in a cover 2, but he'd be, perfect for it. Would be like a Luke Kuechly, and like he has that kind of elite athleticism and smarts to handle that kind of a demanding role. I mean, to the point where if you don't have a middle linebacker that is athletic enough, fast enough, or smart enough, I wouldn't even attempt running a cover 2 scheme. Or at least find somebody fast that you can use, or even if they're not smart right away. So that's the first position. The second position is elite pass rushers along the defensive line. You need more than one. Tampa 2, for all practical purposes, is a scheme where you don't blitz unless you absolutely have to, which means you really need to generate a pass rush with only your front 4. Now, there's been many elite defenses that have accomplished this over the years, so it can be done, but you need special players to do it. You're thinking your Dwight Freeney's at defensive end, your Warren Sapps in the interior. If you can't get pressure with just your defensive line, again, you're probably gonna have a bedtime, and I would recommend not running Tampa 2. Other specific player types, which I would not call your premium resources, like the pass rush and like the middle linebacker, but which nonetheless need to fill a mold and need some specific attributes. Your safeties need to be really fast because they need to cover a lot of ground. They don't have to be the most amazing safeties in the world, but they need to be fast. They need to be able to get from the seam to the sideline. Bonus points if they're hard hitting. In a perfect world, they'd be fast and hard hitting. And also, they definitely need to be sure tacklers because they are your deepest of the deepest safety blanket. What you don't need are these, incredible coverage like ball hawking playmakers that you might find in a cover 1 or cover 3. Those guys don't have to be as fast because they're making plays within a limited range. They're jumping routes, things like that. Your Tampa 2 safeties are really not jumping routes. They just need to have that sideline to sideline speed, be hard hitters to try to drill receivers as soon as they're catching the ball and make sure they tackle because otherwise it's a touchdown. Your outside linebackers need to be strong in coverage. Even better if you can get a premier player like everyone remembers Derek Brooks on the Bucks, interception for TDs for days. What they don't need is they don't need power moves or finesse moves, but they need to be fast. They can be a little bit undersized. You can have those 235-pound guys on the outside. They need to be able to carry receivers and tight ends in their zones, often generating interceptions. Like I said, one of the benefits of Tampa 2 philosophically that I kind of didn't mention before was even though it can be vulnerable versus a power running team, it's not necessarily that weak versus the run if teams are lining up with, say, 3 wide receivers, because you have those linebackers that are fast enough to play zone against wide receiver. They may not be good enough to man up against a wide receiver, but you can stay in your base defense a lot longer, a lot higher percentage of the time when you run Tampa 2 than when you run, a man or cover 3 or types of things where you might want to trot out that nickel corner to deal with things like tight ends. You have the luxury in Tampa 2 of not doing that, which means having that extra linebacker on the field when the offense comes out in 3 or even 4 wide receivers on an early down, and suddenly you have that extra beef to be able to stop the run a little bit more. It doesn't make up for the weakness entirely, but it covers it up a little bit against offenses that try to spread you out. If you are having trouble stopping the run, you have the option to go a little bit bigger and beefier and stronger and run stopping with your defensive tackles on the interior, rather than, if you don't have that Ndamukong Suh or Warren Sapp type that can just create tons of havoc and pressure up the gut by themselves. So if you get those, bigger types, it will help cover up some of that weakness to the run up the gut. But if there's always a trade-off, right? Like now you're left with only 2 edge rushers to really put the pressure on first and second downs. But if you don't have that elite guy in the interior, you might be able to still run it, but then you really need to do some playing around with, putting some bigger guys in on rundowns and maybe substitute a more of a pass rushing specialist into the interior on passing downs. If you don't have that elite player that needs to be on the field 3 downs. But look at who's in your division. Are you playing against a power running team? Or are you playing against some finesse short passing teams? You might be able to get away with with some of the more pass rushing types. So hopefully that kind of covers Tampa 2 on a high level. We're going to jump into a conversation with RaiderRed. So let's jump in there now. All right, we have joining us today RaiderRed of the Dallas Cowboys. He's been in the league since the very beginning of Madden 15, one of the old schoolers if you're new and don't know him. Most of you probably do. He's been with the Cowboys since the beginning. All through Madden 16, he's run a cover 2 Tampa 2 defense. And to my knowledge, he's the only one in the league that actually really ran this as a base D. So what better person to have on and talk about Tampa 2? Raider, how you doing, man?
I'm doing okay, man. How are you?
Doing great. So let's dive right in. Been talking about cover 2 today, obviously. But in our league and in a game like Madden where really what you mostly find is cover 3 and maybe sprinkles of man, why do you gravitate toward Tampa 2 as a base coverage?
Well, it's kind of funny. I've run it since Madden 15, and really it's just because it's one of the few defensive schemes that I know a lot about outside of Madden. I'm not very well versed in the 3-4, So when the Cowboys moved to the Tampa 2, I did a whole bunch of research on it. So naturally, when I started playing Madden, I just gravitated towards it because, I mean, I don't know, man. The Cowboys really just have a roster that's sort of stacked for it. Our corners aren't exceptionally fast, but they can cover, and we have linebackers like Sean Lee that are just sort of freak athletes at the position. So it just makes the most sense to run the Tampa 2 given the personnel I've always had. So that's just really why I went with it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that that you touched on a point that I hope is if there's any key takeaway from all my episodes, which is to actually kind of think about why you're picking a particular front seven or a coverage scheme, is that even if it's as simple as like, hey, it's the one that you know about, that's actually a great reason to run something, because it allows you to make better decisions on what types of players you want to get in there. What kind of adjustments? You said you've been mentioning that you've played cover 2 since the beginning of Madden 15. What kind of adjustments have you had to make as a player to run it more effectively?
Well, man, anybody that knows anything about Madden knows that the cover 2 is sort of weak if you don't understand its weaknesses in Madden. There's not a whole lot of support. I mean, in this year in 17, there's supposed to be Tampa 2 stuff in the book, but there's not a lot of base Tampa 2 stuff in 15 and 16. So I had to spend a lot of time. I'm not very good at using the linebacker, so I had to spend a lot of time understanding what plays I could call and what plays I couldn't, and understanding, what my Will and my Sam and my Mike linebackers, what they are and what they're doing on any given down. Because, I mean, just vanilla cover 2, you're weak down the seams to the tight end, and a lot of people love their tight end, and that's just a Madden thing, and that's a real life thing. People love the tight end. They're versatile. They can do several things, and you got to be able to take that away from them and force them to play into your hand. So, me personally, I had to get better at being more than just the defensive line. I try to bounce around, from spot to spot around the defense based on what I think the offense is going to do, and just do my best to cover up the weaknesses of my cover 2 scheme without the ability to cover over the middle. I've never really been very good at covering as a linebacker.
So let me ask you this. I'm going to kind of roll the next 2 questions together since you're already touching on it. I don't run a cover 2 other than just sprinkling in, the play to mix things up from here and there. So I don't really have like a super strong foundation for how to use her. I have an idea of how I would do it. And I'm interested to maybe try it in Madden 17, but you said you like to bounce around. You said you had to, get a little bit smarter understanding, the different responsibilities of the linebacker. You mentioned specifically that most cover 2 plays in Madden 16 and 15 are not Tampa 2, which means they have these huge glaring weaknesses that Tampa 2 typically takes away. But you can make them into kind of a Tampa 2, which is what you've done. So can you talk a little bit more specifically about like how you bounce around, what you look for, like when do you make a decision to use the linebacker versus the line versus what's your decision process there like?
Basically, before the snap, I spend a lot of time studying football just to play Madden. So I try to take percentages. The vast majority of offenses are more apt to run the ball on first and second down than they are any other down. And first down, running the ball is pretty standard. So, I mean, really, you're sort of picking your poison. But the way I do it is I'll understand where how they're aligned. Do they have a tight end to the right, to the left? Do they have a fullback in? Do I think they're running? How many wide receivers are on the field? And just based on where I guess, and it's the best way I can explain it, based on where I think the ball is going, will tell you where I'm going to be. If I think it's going to be a pass, a lot of times I'll control an edge rusher or the will linebacker, because the will linebacker a lot of times is out in space. He's got 2 or 3 guys to cover. It's hard for Madden to have a linebacker take that responsibility. So sometimes I'll jump on the will linebacker, which is the right outside linebacker in a Tampa 2, and I'll jump on him, and I'll try to cover that mid-flat zone. A lot of people like to dump to the flats if you can frustrate them over the middle. Really and truly, if I think it's a run, I'll float to the defensive tackles, and I'll try to blow up the middle and force them outside. And if I think it's a run, I'll blow up the middle, and I'll QB contain, because I like the angle that my defensive ends get on a QB contain. So if I can blow up the middle, you're going to shoot outside, and I've got 2 linebackers, and I have 2 defensive ends crashing out. So it's really all sort of a mix of understanding the concepts of how people are lining up and understanding where your Tampa 2 is weak, which, I mean, in a Tampa 2, your middle linebacker, his first read is run, and he has to be fast enough to double back and cover the pass in the event that that's what it is. So I try to let Madden do its thing with middle linebackers because usually if you can get them in a deep zone, they're pretty good at getting back, but you have to be there to support the run because, I mean, hopefully Madden 17 run fits work better, but in 15 and 16, sometimes it's just a crapshoot if you're actually going to get that hold or not. So really,
Yeah,
the best advice I have for anybody is just learn how to read an offense, and it's really a lot of guessing. I mean, defense is a guessing game.
Yeah, it's interesting because I actually think that, like, you know, if it's execute a little bit better in Madden 17, although I still thought it was viable in Madden 16. Obviously, you ran it and you win over 10 games pretty much every season. So I always thought that it kind of fits how most users like to play Madden, in that, you know, user the middle linebacker. Not everyone does. I usually don't. It sounds like you don't a whole lot, but a lot of people like that. So, and that actually kind of fits the cover two really well, because you do need that huge range, like you talked about, the ability to shut down the run while dropping into a deep third zone if necessary. So people typically use or cover the tight end as it is. So why not do it in a defense where you are supposed to use or cover the tight end?
Yeah, that's 100% accurate. I mean, I've tried to get better at using the middle linebacker because I feel like my defense could go to the next level if I could, but and if it's the run, I can get the run, but I bite on play action a lot, so I try to let the middle linebacker do his thing.
Great. Any other particular advice or tips for newer players on if they think they have the personnel to run Tampa 2 that you throw out there?
Man, the best thing I can say is, I mean, I ran it for Madden 15. I've had success. I can't say that it's not a successful defense. A lot of people think that cover two is super weak, and it's really not. I mean, cover two is the easiest shell to run because you don't have to have elite corners. You know, man defense, if you don't have elite corners, you're dead in the water. I mean,
yeah, no question.
When you're running Tampa 2, you can have, 90, 89, 88 speed corners with good acceleration because those guys aren't having to carry a guy all the way down the field alone. You've got two safeties over the top helping. So if you want to run a cover 2, Tampa 2, any sort of shell like that, my best advice is just sit down and pick apart your personnel. Just look at what you have. Do you have a middle linebacker with a decent acceleration rating that can cover the middle of the field? And if he doesn't really have that, are you comfortable running that middle linebacker and understanding that you have to cover the run and cover a deep third if needed? I mean, I was having so much trouble in 16 translating my Tampa 2 until I talked to you, and you helped me iron out my personnel. So really and truly, the best thing I've got is, like, you can win plenty of games running Tampa 2, and just because the Tampa 2 is all about bend but don't break. You can let that 3 or 4 yard pass go as long as you don't let that 20 or 25 yard pass go. So just understand you're going to give up a lot of chunks. This is something that took me a while. Understand you're going to give up a lot of underneath routes. You're going to get a little frustrated, but sort of like you run your man, like, if I can get you into 4 or 5 or 6 third down and short, I'm going to stop you on one of those third and short.
Yep, no, absolutely. Love it. That's exactly what it's designed for. So, yep, I appreciate it. Well, thank you very much for coming on. I think that should be pretty helpful if someone's kind of trying to evaluate whether or not they have the team or the interest to run this coverage. Good luck this season.
Thank you.
All right, there you have it for cover 2. So we'll be returning next week to talk about cover 3, the defense that probably the most people in Madden tend to play. So I won't cover too much detail in terms of what it is. You're probably mostly familiar with that. But we'll go into hopefully a little bit more detail in terms of what player type you need and where you can sacrifice and where do you need your premium guys. So I appreciate everyone listening. Hope you enjoyed it, and catch you next week.